Yes, let me set my sword stick down and set the lecture down. We'll see when we get to that. Yes, this is Alexandria, is it not? I don't have to send my poor wife a telegram that I once had to send. I was on a lecture tour somewhere and sent her a telegram that simply said, "M at Market Harbor. Oh, where ought I to be?" Well, here I am. Even you're looking wide awake. I'll see what I can do about that in the next few minutes. That reminds me of my poor wife, Frances, again, and our wedding night. Might I just tell you a bit about it? Not everything, just a bit about it. After the ceremony, we got to the hotel, and I decided to go for a walk, which is what I was doing just now. You see, all of my mental doors open up onto a world that I did not make. Yes, I love to see things, and I appreciate the goodness of things. It's part really of my trilogy, the goodness of things, the equality of man, and redemption through comradeship. Well, we got to the hotel, and I went for a walk, and as you might imagine, I got hopelessly lost. And by the time I got back to the hotel and to my bride, she was sound asleep. And I didn't think I ought to awaken her, even to apologize. And I have been apologizing to her ever since. I wish I could tell you that I was late because I was debating any number of the enemies of the church, including, I heard a reference to Mr. Shaw. Yes, George Bernard Shaw. I must tell you, there was one debate in particular for which I was on time, and he was late. There I was at my podium waiting for him to come in, and he walked in looking even more gaunt than usual. You've seen pictures of him, haven't you? And I turned to him and I said, "Well, George, taking a good look at you, there certainly must have been a famine in whatever part of England you've come from." Do you know what he said? He said, "Well, looking at you, Gilbert, we can certainly see who caused it." Well, I'll have to give him that. I won't give him much more, but I'll give him that. In the middle of that debate, I was defending the common man of England, and now that I'm here, I will defend the common man of your country. And do you know what Shaw said to me in response? He said, "Gilbert, the only feeling I have for the English common man is a desire to abolish him and replace him with someone sensible." He said that. I couldn't believe it. He had no thought, no respect at all for the ordinary beer-drinking, creed-making, fight-provoking, ever-lovable, ever-sensual, ever-sensible common man. You see, he should have taken a lesson from Christ himself. What did Christ do? Better yet, what didn't he do when it came time to found his church? He didn't turn to the brilliant Paul, did he? Nor did he turn to the mystic John. Instead, he turned to a shuffler, a coward, a snob, in sum, a man. And on that rock, he built his church, and the gates of hell shall never prevail against it. A weak man he was, but no chain is stronger than its weakest link. Yes, Shaw embodied any number of things that I cannot abide. Yes, a prohibitionist. And it is 1934, isn't it? I vowed I would not come back to your country until prohibition had ended. And now that it has, here I thank God I wasn't asked my opinion when I came in 1921 or again in 1930. I wasn't asked my opinion than prohibition. Instead, I was asked if I was an anarchist. It was right there on the form. But I didn't know what to put, and I looked at the next question. It asked me if I was a polygamist. I thought of writing down not so lucky or not so stupid, or that the 47 women with me were all of my secretaries. And it reminded me, I left that one blank as well. It reminded me of something I read about one of your presidents, the only one I have ever met. He came to England in 1910 after his African safari. That gives it away, doesn't it? Yes, Mr. Roosevelt. And you know, there had been a controversy during his presidency over the seating in the Senate of Reed Smoot from Utah, who had been a polygamist, but had forsworn it. And the Democrats would not seat him because he had been a polygamist. Well, the press asked Roosevelt what he thought about that. And you know what he said? He said, I would rather have in the United States Senate a polygamist who doesn't polygamize than a monogamist who doesn't monogamize. Yes, I liked that very, very much. Well, back to the form. I left the first two blank. The third question asked me if I favored overthrowing the government of the United States by force of arms. Yes, it was really there. Again, I didn't know what to put, and I thought I had to write something, or I would never be permitted in. And so in response to that question, I wrote the following. I said I didn't know whether I favored overthrowing the government of the United States by force of arms, but I would much prefer to answer such a question at the end of my journey rather than the beginning. Well, I was permitted in. And you know something, when I came just a few years ago, in 1930, I almost became a convert to prohibition. Yes, I was at Notre Dame lecturing, and virtually every evening I was invited into a professor's home. And at every meal, we had wine or beer or both. Because you see, they were making them right in their own homes. And then I thought, maybe your Congress was up to something, really on to something. In fact, maybe you ought to persuade your Congress to pass a law banning the making and the selling and the manufacture of scarves and woolens and mittens and jellies and jams. And then mothers would start making them in their own homes again. Well, I wasn't entirely serious, but I did almost think prohibition made sense. Yes, Shaw was something else he embodied that I cannot abide. He was a vegetarian. Although I must tell you, I must confide something here. I too am a vegetarian. Between meals. You might know my poem, do you? The Logical Vegetarian? You will find me drinking rum like a sailor in a slum. You will find me drinking beer like a Bavarian. You will find me drinking gin in the lowest sort of inn, because I am a happy vegetarian. Well, I cleared that inn of wine and tried to climb a sign and sought to hail the constable as Marion. So he bowled me in the beak and refused to let me speak, because I am myself a vegetarian. I once knew a Dr. Gluck, and his nose had a hook, and his attitudes were anything but Aryan. So I gave him all the pork that I had upon my fork, because you see, I am a vegetarian. I'm silent in the pub, I'm silent in the club, I'm silent on the bally peak of Darien, for I stuff away for life, shoveling peas in with a knife, because I am at heart a vegetarian. No more the milk of cows shall pollute my private house than the milk of the wild mares of the barbarian. No, I will stick to port and sherry, for they are so very, very, so very, very, very vegetarian. Yes, thank you. Thank you. It's getting rather warm. Let me take this off. Shaw was many things that I cannot abide. He was a socialist, an imperialist. And really, when you think about it, they're pretty much the same, aren't they? They both believe in power, above all else, in concentrated, haughty, overreaching power. Now, there was a time long ago when I was much younger, when I was a socialist. So long as I could believe, wrongly I know now, that socialism meant protecting the weak. And yes, there was a time when I was a good deal younger, when I did think of myself as an imperialist. So long as I could believe, wrongly I know now, that imperialism meant protecting England. Yes. And Shaw also was a feminist. A feminist. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But you see, any number of things that he embodied that I cannot abide. But I wasn't debating him or other enemies of the church. Let me tell you, before we get to the lecture, about some of my occasional debates. It wasn't long ago that I was debating an enemy who said, Mr. Chesterton, your church is responsible for any number of wars, violence, revolution. What do I have to say about that? I turned to him and I said, why, naturally. What did you expect from fallen man? The unique thing about the church is not that we have committed wrongs. No, the unique thing about the church is that we admit to them. Yes. Do I believe in fallen man? Do I believe in the story of Adam and Eve? Of course I do. It's common sense. It's mystical common sense. It's given us a vision of the perfect man in the mind of God, in the eyes of God. Not Superman, not Nietzsche's Superman or Shaw's Superman, but the perfect man that we aspire to be, don't we? In a way that is different from every other animal. Let me put it to you this way. What would you do if you were about to see a fellow getting ready to consume his 10th whiskey? Well, you'd pound him on the back and say, stop it, be a man. Now, if you were to witness a crocodile about to consume its 10th explorer, you wouldn't pound the crocodile on the back, would you? And say, cut it out, be a crocodile. Because, of course, the crocodile is being a crocodile. Well, I know we have all fallen with Adam, but we shall rise with Christ. Of course, the commands of Christ are impossible, but they're not insanity. What they are, of course, are sanity preached to a planet of lunatics. Oh, there are those who say, and I've heard this in debates, Mr. Chesterton, I've heard people say, the commands of Christ might have been reasonable for his time, but they can't possibly be reasonable for our time. Really now? One wonders how reasonable they were for his time, given what happened to him on Calvary. And really, of course, that was the point of the story, wasn't it? It was not an afterthought. Gathered there around the cross were all sorts of people who embodied this notion that the world could do no more, that man could not save himself. Oh, I know when my friends on Fleet Street discovered that I believed that Christ really is God, that he is who he says he is. Yes, the full horror of it all, the disgraceful truth of it, that that's what I believe. That he was not a being apart from a man and God, like an elf. And he wasn't a being part man and part something else, like a centaur. Yeah, he was exactly who he said he was. I heard myself being introduced as the Prince of Paradox, and this, of course, is the ultimate paradox, isn't it? That Christ was wholly God and holy man. This is really the ultimate paradox. And what do paradoxes do? They embody big truths, and the bigger the truth, the more able it is to embody it. It's a seeming contradiction, which of course reveals an important truth. And ours is a revealed religion, isn't it? And what did it tell us? What does it tell us? Among other things, it tells us that omnipotence did not make God complete. That God, in order to be holy God, must have been just as much of a rebel as a king. Really, when you think about it, it's the only religion that has added courage to the list of the virtues of the Creator. Oh, I know the enemies of the church won't give up. And sometimes our friends won't either. I have had friends in our church tell me that they think our church should move with the world. I don't want a church that moves with the world. I want a church that moves the world. The world, you see, doesn't really progress, does it? It wobbles. It wobbles this way, and it wobbles that way. And sometimes, of course, the church is going in the wrong direction. I'm sorry, the world is going in the wrong direction. And so what do we want to follow that for? I certainly don't. And really, the church is the only thing that prevents me from being a child of my age. I don't want to be a child of my age. Let me put it to you this way. The Catholic Church is the only thing that saves me from the degraded slavery of being a child of my age. So yes, it should be a fighting faith. Yes, very much so, a fighting faith. Well, it's also true. It's also true, isn't it, that the church, as I think of it, is really a kind of private detective, isn't it? I know I have been in debates where enemies of the church accuse it of promoting the stake and the rack. And of course they have existed. But they represent the weakness of the church. They represent its surrenders and snobberies. But it isn't really, of course, the heart of the church. As I do think of the church as a private detective, forever countering that official detective, the state. And what has the state done but create enormous machineries of punishment? Yes, bloody and brutal everywhere, at least at some time, in some places, in some ways. But the church, what have we done? What has the church done but created machinery of pardon? It doesn't seek out crime to avenge that crime or to punish the criminal, but to forgive him. Really, the oddity of the church, the specialty of the church, is its mercy, its merciless mercy. When I think of the church, I think of an eternal sleuth hound, forever seeking to save and not to slay. And of course, enemies of the church think of orthodoxy as safe and dull and heavy and humdrum. But at the heart of orthodoxy is sanity. Yes, it's much more exciting, much more thrilling, much more dangerous at times, much more fun to be sane than it is to be mad. And it is sane. Why? Because orthodoxy means you have achieved a certain equilibrium. And not the equilibrium in the ordinary sense of the term, but the equilibrium of a man behind madly rushing horses, this way and that way. But in the end, attaining the grace of statuary, the accuracy of arithmetic. When I think of the early church, I think of it as a madly rushing war horse, heading this way and that way. But it would be wrong, not to mention unhistorical, to say that the church fell for this fashion or that one, or this fad or that one, or this vulgar fanaticism or that one. Instead, it had to swerve now and again to avoid those momentarily enormous obstacles. There was a time when it had to swerve to avoid the enormous obstacle of Arianism, which was out to make the church too worldly. And later, to avoid an Orientalism, which was out to make the church too unworldly. You see, the church has never followed the tame course. It's never followed the routine conventions, has it? It's never been respectable. For example, in the 17th century, it would have been respectable to be a Calvinist. But the church never fell into that bottomless pit of predestination, did it? No. Man is damnable, but he's not damned. No. It's always easy to be a heretic. It's always easy to be a madman. It's easy to be a modernist. It's easy to be a snob. But to avoid them all is really one great thrilling adventure. To avoid the obstacles of Gnosticism and Christian Science has been one great adventure. As I think of the church as a heavenly chariot, riding, careening through the ages, while the dull heresies lie prostrate in its wake, and the wild truth remains reeling but erect. Well, we haven't even gotten to the lecture yet. Oh dear. Before I lecture, might I sit down just for a moment? Oh dear. Oh yes. What? Cheese and water. Prohibition isn't still in force, is it? This is looking awfully pale. Oh dear, cheese. Poets have been mysteriously silent on the subject of cheese, haven't they? Here I am, and there you are. And I should think somewhere right there should be the line between us. In fact, might we make a promise to one another before I proceed any further this evening? I pledge to you that so long as we are together the rest of this evening, I shan't cross that line. Will you promise to be similarly bound? Oh, good. Now that that is done, we are ready for great possibilities, even adventures that are really quite limitless. Limitless? Didn't I just say that I believe in limits, boundaries, frames? Oh, yes, I did. Does that seem contradictory to you? It doesn't to me at all. After all, the largest wilderness seems ever so much larger to me when I observe it through a window. Why, look at me. Do I seem large to you? It's only an illusion. I just appear this large because this little stage is your window. You don't believe me, do you? And well, you shouldn't, because I really am this large, and I have been for quite some time. In fact, not long after the Great War against the Kaiser commenced, I was walking along Fleet Street in London, minding my own business, when a young lady stopped me cold with these words. "Sir," she fairly bellowed at me, "why aren't you out at the front?" To which I replied, "Young lady, if you kindly step around this way, you'd quite plainly see that I already am out at the front." And on my way here, I was getting into the taxi cab and having a bit of difficulty. The driver came around and suggested that I get in sideways. And I turned to him and I said, "Young man, as you can plainly see, I have no sideways." But the point remains a valid one, doesn't it? What do you see when you stand in the open air and gaze at a mountain range? tell you what I see. I see utter puniness. But that same mountain range, when I observe it through a window, suddenly looks wondrous, majestic, immense. My father taught me that lesson when I was very young. He built me a toy theater, which I loved, both because he built it and because it was so very small. You see, only in very small spaces can you fully comprehend very big ideas. After all, in the narrow streets of Florence, Dante thought there was room for heaven and hell and purgatory. And in our little theater, I discovered romance and wonder and terror in its glorious castles and gloomy sepulchres, all revealed to me by my father, the man with the golden key, we called him. My father was really a man of many hobbies. He earned a living too. He helped to sell houses when the mood struck him. But in the main, he was an old-fashioned Englishman who spent most of his days filling up his own house with his life. If he'd been some ordinarily ambitious millionaire who owned 50 mills manufacturing greatcoats or 100 machines spewing forth cocoa into huge vats, how much smaller he would have seemed to me. But precisely because he made something small, and in the smallest of whole numbers, I might add, he never seemed small to me at all. And to this day, I thank God that my father never tried to make a career out of his hobby. Had he made even, what do you suppose, even 10 toy theaters, our own little theater would have lost its importance. And he would have lost his love affair with his art and his standing as an amateur. I have for you what I think is the perfect motto for the true amateur who does what he does simply for the love of it. And it is this: if something is worth doing, then it is worth doing. Oh, I think I heard the right answer over here, didn't I? Was it you, sir? If something is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. Yes. Yes. A paradox again, but expressing a truth, doesn't it? Now, I discovered about Robert Louis Stevenson. I was writing an essay, and I can't really say I was doing research. I don't really do research, but I discovered that he loved to paint. But I also discovered that he wasn't very good at it. And so that's when it hit me. Yes, he loved doing it. And so that's what I wrote in the essay. If it's something is worth doing in your mind, then it's worth doing badly. Well, it was after that essay was published that I got a letter from an irate reader. A man had written to tell me that a few mornings earlier, his wife had burned the toast and dropped it in front of him and said, "If something is worth doing, it's worth doing badly, G.K. Chesterton." And he wanted to know what I should do about this. He should do about it. Well, I wrote back and told him, why, you could shoot her, of course. But no, short of that, I said, tell her that I meant that, of course, in reference to oneself. If you find it worth doing badly, worth doing, yes, it's worth doing badly. Now, it's not true of everything, is it? No, if you want an expedition mounted to the North Pole, you'd probably want it done quite well. But for many things in life, sports, games, for example, if it's worth doing, yes. In my case, croquet, which I love to play, but at which I am terrible. But I say no one loves croquet until one has been beaten at it, and badly beaten at that. It's simply not true that the croquet player loves the game more as he plays it better. In fact, it's entirely possible to play the game so well that one ceases to enjoy the game at all. The rule ought to be this: the moment the play of a game approaches perfection, whatever the game is, then the love of the game, the fun of the game, probably disappears. It's true of music, I should think, isn't it? Oh, I suppose a fine musician can say that he loves being a musician. But more often than not, I should think it's the bad musician who truly loves to make music. And my father found many things that he loved doing, most of which involved making things right in our home, and a few of which he did rather well. All this talk about the dullness of domesticity is so much nonsense. My father wasn't dull. How could he be dull? He made things, as did my mother. I'll hear nothing of the degrading drudgery of mothers who make puddings and pies. To make things, there is nothing greater that can be said of God or man than that we make things. No millionaire manufacturer can say that. He can just pay other people to have things made and to claim all the while that he is making good. Making good. The phrase really makes no sense, does it? I suppose one can say that one makes good beer barrels or good pork pies, but what does it mean to say that one is making good? Worse than that, in one twist of bad logic, it tangles up two things that have stood in stark contrast to one another in every decent society throughout history, namely moral greatness and mere material success. But the verb to make, standing all by itself, is a wonderful verb, a marvelous verb, a verb that implies liberty and creation. When a man makes his way through a piece of wood, he alone has created something new. Modern people, frivolous people, really, people who have never made anything in their lives, like to talk about the narrowness, the unbearable stuffiness of the Victorian home. Nonsense. I learned to make toffee in my parents' home, and to eat it as well. How can an amateur toffee maker, a toffee maker who also loves to eat toffee, possibly be accused of stuffiness? Stickiness, perhaps, but not stuffiness. I learned to make toffee in my parents' home. It was there that I also learned the true meaning of liberty. Liberty, you see, is the God in man, or at least the artist in us. But modern man conceives of liberty as something external, as something granted to us by an outside power, no doubt a government. But to me, liberty is something entirely internal, something buried in one's imagination, something waiting to be awakened, perhaps by a book. Something else my father did rather well was to read aloud to us, which he did superbly. And more than was the norm even then, I might add, thereby turning me into a potential madman. What is madness, after all, but a preference for the books over the reality of something? Oh, books can be sacred objects, I grant you that. In it, the largest jewels can be shut away into the smallest of caskets, but still, a book is only a symbol of man's impression of existence. And the person who has come to prefer books to life is a madman. The same fashion as the miser who prefers money to everything else. Money, you see, is a symbol as well. Oh, it can symbolize wonderful things such as wine and horses and the great cities of the world. And the miser is the madman who prefers mere money to all of them. I much prefer laughter and tears to money or things. For that matter, I try very hard not to take money or things at all seriously. I even try not to take books seriously, not even my own. There have been times when I have been forced to take my bouts with madness seriously, especially my own. I think that all began with my father reading fairy tales about goblins and such to us when we were children. Fools tell us that it is cruel to read fairy tales about goblins and such to children. Such fools, of course, have forgotten what a child is like. What will the child do if you withhold goblins from him? He'll make them up, of course. One small child in the dark can invent more hells than Dante. But fools tell us that fairy tales create fear in children. Nonsense. Fear is always present in children. It's for the most part a reasonable fear at that, because this world can be a frightening, alarming, even evil place. It isn't fairy tales that give the child his first idea of evil. If anything, it's fairy tales that give the child his first idea of the possible defeat of evil. Every child with an imagination has known intimately a fire-breathing. Fairy tale provides, of course, is St. George, with which to slay that dragon. So my father was far from an awful man to read them to us. And if some dreadful drone of a psychologist should come along to tell me that I carry on a childish romance with fairy tales and toy theaters, and that such a childish romance has something to do with my childish father, I shall simply respond in a voice of Christian patience and resignation, why, yes, you fool, yes. I suppose my father was childish. I can only hope that I was and still am. And yet I'd wager that at least one of us was respectable. In fact, I was born at a time, 1874 to be precise, when the word respectability actually had some dim connection with the idea of being respected. The young deserve to be taught the truth. Instead, we teach them modern subjects such as psychology. And what is psychology but the mind studying itself instead of the truth? Speaking of which, a little couplet about Sigmund Freud. The well-informed pronounce it Freud, whether to cavil or applaud. The ill-informed pronounce it Froude, but I pronounce it fraud. In psychology or otherwise, modern educators have this crazed idea that teachers should roar things out of the students, as though buried somewhere in the dim recesses of the boy's soul is a primordial yearning to master Greek accents or long division or the proper spelling of English words. Some things may be drawn out of the students, squeals and grunts, I suppose, if you poke them hard enough. But a teacher will wait a very long time before drawing the grammar of the English language out of them. That you've got to put into them first. But modern educators disagree, as they say that school must be enjoyed. Nonsense, school isn't to be enjoyed. It's to be endured. Boyhood is to be enjoyed. Did I use the past tense there? Enjoyed? When would I have ceased to be a boy? Not when I reached the age of majority or left my parents' home, or certainly not now that I am 60. And really, I can think of no place in between, especially not when I was 27 and married my Frances on my only wedding day. I do have a lecture here, but I have to tell you, if I told you a bit about my wedding night, I have to tell you about my wedding day. On the way to the church, I suddenly realized that I had bought no presents for me. And so I quickly stopped to buy 2 of them. The first was a revolver, and the second was a glass of milk. Now, had my Frances not known me better, she might have suspected that I had become suicidal, or a murderer, or worse than both put together, a teetotaler. But I didn't buy that gun to murder myself or my wife. I was never enough of a modern man to do that. I bought it because it reminded me of some of the great adventures of my youth. Just as I had once protected my parents' home against pirates, so now I would protect my own home against the same or worse. And if I don't have a revolver with me, why then I have this with me. Yes, I carry it with me all the time. And the glass of milk? During the summer when I was a boy, my mother and I would go for a walk every morning. And every morning we would stop at the same dairy for a glass of milk. So I thought it would be an entirely fitting ceremonial to stop there on my wedding day and thereby unite 2 of the great relations of a man's life. After all, we all need a mother to explain the world to us, and at times to shield us from it. And later on, I thought I needed a wife to complete my small world and to tidy me up a bit. Now, Frances surrendered very quickly on that one, deciding instead to make me picturesque. Do you think that she succeeded? Actually, I didn't need Frances to make me wear this. I love wearing things like this. No man needs a wife to make him look heroic or ridiculous. But we all need someone to keep reminding us that small worlds are the only worlds worth inhabiting or observing. Yes, observing. When I was 8 or 9, my parents bought me a microscope, which I loved. Still do. Much prefer it to the telescope. Still do. Yes. And just as I know it's always presumed that a child is forever longing for faraway horizons, but I don't think it's true. I know that when I was a boy, I was always preoccupied with dividing and subdividing the actual space available to me, or behind this curtain, or under the piano, or back behind those whatever they are back there. Yes, only in a place like that can one fully comprehend a truth that the modern world has quite forgotten. It's the same truth that Daniel Defoe tried to teach us. Have you read Robinson Crusoe? I try to read it at least once a year. Not for the solemn duty, but the honest joy of it. And not for the reason you might suppose. I was never charmed or fascinated by wondering how it was that Robinson Crusoe got to that faraway island. Now, to me, the real charm, the real fascination was, of course, that he could find no way off of it. I was giving a lecture somewhere, I really was, and Robinson Crusoe probably crept into it, because I remember during the question period, someone asked me what book I would choose to have with me if I happened to be stranded on a desert island. I said, why, Thompson's Guide to Practical Shipbuilding, of course. Flippant answer, really. I think it would have been anything by Dickens, especially the Pickwick Papers. Dickens wrote for ordinary people, didn't he? He didn't write for intellectuals. He wrote so simply that even intellectuals could understand him. He was a poet of the poor, a poet forever climbing upward on weary wings, trying to reach the heavens of the poor. Now, I would have waited a very long time before consulting any guide to shipbuilding. Otherwise, I would have missed all of the fun, the excitement, the charm, the fascination of Robinson Crusoe, alone on that island, alone with his gun, his parrot, his axe, and that little hoard of grain. Well, I trust I've given you at least a glimpse into my childhood, and perhaps a bit of an understanding of my views on the larger world as well. And if any among you would have the temerity to suggest that I have grounded the whole of my social philosophy on the antics of a child, I shall be quite content to bow and smile and mutter to myself, yes, yes, you fool, yes. Well, you have come to hear a lecture, and I haven't given you one, and so in the time that we have remaining, let me at least make an attempt at giving you a bit of a lecture. I hate to disappoint anyone. It won't be long. There are a few people. This lecture is called Babies and Distributism. And by the way, I should tell you, I am a distributist. I am not a capitalist, and I am not a socialist. I am a distributist. I'm not a politician either. I created in 1926, a few years ago, the Distributists League in honor of my dead brother Cecil. Politics, I think, should be left to the politicians. They're the only people dull enough not to be bored by it. So no, it was simply a Distributists League to promote the idea of the wide and wider distribution of property. Property is like muck. It's only good, I should think, if it's spread around. Either private property is good for man or it is not. And if it is not, let us all become courageous communists and be done with it. But if it is good for man, then I say it is good for every man. And so are babies. Let me get to the lecture. There are few people whom I hold in personal contempt. To be sure, there are some for whom I feel sorry. For example, I feel sorry for the atheist, who is constrained by his own logic to a very sad negative simplification. You know, even in my darkest hours when I was at Slade Art School, I was 18, 19, and going through a very dark period of close to unbelief, but I always held on to one thin thread of thanks. Yes, and it struck me, I should think during those terrible years, that until we realize that things might not be, we can't realize that things are. Until we can imagine non-entity, we underrate the victory of God. It must be one of the million wild jests of the truth that we know nothing until we know nothing. So yes, I did hang on, even during those dark times. And I also feel sorry for the Bolshevik, who is driven by another negative simplification to revolt against some very positive wrongs. But again, I wrote an essay. I promise you, I will get to the finish of this. But sometime in the middle of the 1920s, the madness of tomorrow, I wrote, does not reside in Moscow, but in Manhattan. Bolshevism won't last. I don't know how long it will last, but it won't last. Because you see, it flies in the face of human nature. And this gets us back to property. It is part of our nature to desire to have some property, to own something. And the Bolsheviks seek to eliminate this. It won't survive. And furthermore, the Bolsheviks, even after prolonged and extravagant experiment, have discovered that the family is a real institution. And furthermore, they have discovered that there is no substitute for it. I fear that our gradual experiment in abandoning domesticity might lead us to a terrible and terribly different conclusion. And really, without the family, we are all helpless before the state, are we not? Well, and furthermore, the greater danger, what did I mean when I said the madness of tomorrow resides in Manhattan? I was being alliterative, I will plead guilty, but I was making a point, I hope, that the real revolution that might engulf us, and might also contribute to the destruction of the family, is of course the sexual revolution. That will be much harder to defeat because, of course, it runs up against our fallen human nature, doesn't it? It's part of our fallen nature. Unlike the Bolshevik experiment to do away with property. Well, let me continue here. But there is one group of people in particular for whom I feel a great deal of contempt and for whom I do not feel at all sorry. I am speaking of those propagandists who absurdly describe themselves as advocates of what they prefer to call birth control. Yes, birth control. I don't know about here, but in England it's coming to mean fewer and fewer births and less control. While I am at it, I must add that I despise the very term birth control. It's a weak and wobbly and cowardly term. Worse than all of that, it is a lie. It is a lie because the purpose behind it is not really to control any birth, but rather to make sure that there shall not be any births to control. If these propagandists were honest, they would tell us that they actually favor birth prevention, wouldn't they? But they don't dare be honest enough to call them advocates of birth prevention. Nor do they dare to organize campaigns to promote birth prevention. Why? Because they know very well that the very term birth prevention would send a chill across the land the instant that it was emblazoned in a headline. Secondly, I despise birth control because it is a weak and wobbly and cowardly thing. And it is especially cowardly because many advocates of birth control, or, let's be honest, birth prevention, also believe in eugenics, don't they? But really now, putting in place a regime of something called birth control isn't at all consistent with a regime of eugenics, is it? In truth, a campaign to prevent births is a campaign that refuses to take so much as the first step along that dark road to eugenics. You see, a true believer in eugenics would treat babies as we often treat newborn kittens. Do I make myself clear? If not, let me be very clear. Instead of preventing babies from being born, advocates of eugenics ought to call for all babies to be born, and then drown those they decide that they do not like, or that they decide that are not fit. I really can't see any objection to this, except the moral or mystical sort of objection that we advance against birth prevention itself. When you think about it, a serious advocate of eugenics should dismiss a campaign for birth prevention as little better than a weak compromise. After all, a regime of birth prevention alone might mean sacrificing the fit and saving the unfit. If we simply concentrate on preventing births, we might well be preventing the birth of the best and most beautiful, not to mention the strongest of children, while those we allow may well turn out to be the weakest or the worst. So let me be very clear. Until I see a real pioneer, a genuinely progressive leader, put forth a bold scientific program for drowning babies, I will not join their movement. There. Well, let me conclude on a slightly happier note. Let me give you one more poem, if I might, and then I'll take a few questions. If I should be a heathen, I'd praise the purple vine. My slaves would dig the vineyard, and I would drink the wine. But Higgins is a heathen. Oh dear, Higgins is a heathen who drinks some tepid milk exactly twice a day. I'm forgetting a line there, but let me persist. If I should be a heathen, I'd crown Nere's curls. I'd fill my life with love affairs, my house with dancing girls. But Higgins is a heathen, and to lecture rooms is forced, where his aunts who are not married demand to be divorced. If I should be a heathen, I'd send my armies forth and drag behind my chariots the chieftains of the north. But Higgins is a heathen who drives his dreary quill that lends the poor that funny cash that makes them poorer still. Now if I should die a heathen, why, I'd pile my pyre on high and in a great red whirlwind go roaring to the sky. But Higgins did die a heathen and a far richer man than I. And yet they put him in an oven and baked him like a pie. Now it's not for me to ponder this riddle that I write of why this poor old heathen should sin without delight. No, it's up to you to ponder now that I am finally done, the lot of he who lacked the faith and would not have any fun. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. If there are any questions, I would perhaps try to answer, and if I can't, I'll have the alter ego answer. Is there a question? Oh, yes, ma'am.
Why did you become Catholic?
Why did I become Catholic? Because it promised to forgive my sins. Of course. It's really as simple as that. Yes.
Did you have anyone in mind, particularly when you created your Father Brown character?
Well, Father Connor, yes, the fellow the priest who brought me to the church, who, of course, never broke the seal of the confessional, but didn't have to tell me how much he knew about our fallen human nature. And so therefore he thought he was, I thought he was in a good position to be a detective, or at least a fictional detective. In the back...
What do you think will become of communism?
Of what?
Communism.
Of communism?
Yes.
Yes, well, I don't think it will survive. I don't know how long it will last. I understand that your President Roosevelt has just extended diplomatic recognition to the regime, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, since they have been in charge for these 16 years. But again, for the reason I outlined in my ruminations here, I don't think we have to worry about them in the long run. I can't say how long that might be, but human nature will assert itself at some point and overthrow this dastardly regime.
Is your wife Catholic?
Yes. Now, you see, she was a good Anglican. She was the first person I ever met who truly practiced a religion. It was almost like gardening with her. My father and my mother were both Unitarian Universalists, so we were essentially nothing. And the circle of friends were the same. And the Victorian period was a period of extreme rationality. Everything could be somehow rationally explained. I sometimes think, in my biography of St. Francis, that was why he became attractive in the 19th century. Every saint really, every age is converted, when you think about it, by the saint that contradicts it most. And St. Francis certainly contradicted the rationalism of my youth. And our age is an age of feelings, of sentiment, isn't it? And so perhaps St. Thomas will be the saint who will convert us, the saint that contradicts our age the most. Well, I was married in the Anglican Church, but I became increasingly convinced of the truth of the Catholic Church and the history of the Catholic Church. And so I really was on my way, I think, well before I actually did take the step. And it wasn't until I had been to the Holy Land, after the war, the Great War, and I fear there will be another one. I fear that you might want to read my book, The End of the Armistice. Prussianism is still a danger. But I lost my train of thought there. What was I going to say?
Becoming Catholic.
They're going to the Holy Land. Yes, after that war. Yes, I went there for any number of reasons. I went there to see the Muslim world, as well as to see the Jews there. I am a Zionist. The Jews need a homeland. They need to become hewers of wood, and they need to become plumbers and farmers, and to have a place where they can do that. And so, yes, I am that, and I do worry about the Muslim world and what it is going to foretell. I don't think we have heard the last of them. I think, in fact, I might tell you that I'm much more worried in the great future of the West, the great future of Christendom, about Muslims than I am about communists. But I can't predict, of course, where all this is going to lead. But I came back from that trip convinced that I was going to become a Catholic. And on the way home, we stopped in Brindisi, and I looked at the statue there of the Blessed Virgin, and that really did it. You see, I couldn't convert because Francis would not convert. But after I did, not immediately, but a few years later, I think 1926 it was, she converted as well.